Member for Pascoe Vale.
Thank you, Acting Speaker, and it's good to see you in the chair as well. I rise to speak in support of the Aboriginal Land Legislation Amendment Bill 2024, and in doing so I would also like to begin by paying my respects to the First Nations people and traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, live, learn and work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, particularly Uncle Andrew Gardner, who is a representative of these traditional lands in the First People's Assembly of Victoria. I would also like to acknowledge, of course, the member for Geelong for her fantastic contribution from the outset, our good friend, the member for Northern Metropolitan Region, Miss Watt, in the other place, and also Senator for Victoria, Senator Jana Stewart. Acting Speaker, as stated by then Prime Minister Paul Keating on the 15th of November 1993, quote, "When the High Court of Australia handed down the Mabo judgment in 1992, it set our generation of Australians a great challenge. The court's decision was unquestionably just. It rejected a lie and acknowledged a truth. The lie was terra nullius, the convenient fiction that Australia had been a land of no one. The truth was native title, the fact that the land had once belonged to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, and that in some places a legal right to it had survived the 200 years of European settlement. So here was an issue the country could not ignore, either legally or morally. There was another form of title that had to become part of the way we managed land in Australia. We owe it to Aboriginal Australians, to all Australians. We owe it to our fair and democratic traditions and to the future generations of Australians to recognise this native title. Over tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal people had developed a complex culture built on a profound attachment to the land. The land nourished them spiritually as well as materially. In the landscape and the life upon it, they saw evidence of the epoch of creation. Down through the generations, they passed on laws, customs, traditions and ceremonies reflecting an obligation to care for the land which went to the heart of their society. Yet this most remarkable fact about Australia, the oldest continuous civilisation on earth, has until now, that is 1993 too, been denied by Australian law. The first European settlers declared that the land had belonged to no one and the Indigenous Australians were shunted aside, often with appalling brutality. Much of the despair and degradation, conflict and disease, and many of the problems which Aboriginal Australians face today are a consequence of this very dispossession. We have no need nor any use for guilt. This generation cannot be held responsible for the cruelty of previous generations. But to ignore Mabo would be the final act of cruelty, and we would be held responsible by the world and by future generations of Australians, and they would be right to hold us, that is this generation, responsible. Acting Speaker, in rising to speak on this bill, I'm also very proud, of course, to be part of this Victorian Labor Government that has long remained committed to building on this historic Mabo decision and over more recent years remained committed to fulfilling the aspirations of the Uluru Statement from the heart through voice, treaty and truth. We are proud of the first state to have established the first voice in Australia for First Nations people through the landmark establishment of the First People's Assembly of Victoria, an independent, democratically elected body that now represents traditional owners of country and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Victoria. We are proud of the first state to have established a formal truth-telling commission through the Uluru Justice Commission, which is helping us to begin understanding the full history of Australia. The one that dates way back before the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788, and one that stems way back before modern-day Melbourne was first established from 1835 thereabouts onwards. A history, in fact, that dates back 60,000 years. And Acting Speaker, we are, of course, also the first state in Australia to be progressing a genuine treaty with First Nations people through the establishment of the Treaty Authority and the creation of the Treaty Framework and Commissioner. And Acting Speaker, in acknowledging every one of these incredible initiatives, it's essential to point out that every one of these milestones have been supported, delivered and continue to be facilitated proudly by this Victorian Labor Government. This approach is about listening and walking with our First Nations communities, an approach that stands in very stark contrast with the approach of the Liberal National Opposition. When it comes to voice, we had the Liberal National Opposition oppose the campaign against the creation of a federal voice to Parliament, with the opposition leader choosing to ignore the overwhelming yes vote in his own community of Hawthorn at the expense of pandering to the right wing of his party. When it comes to the Uluru Justice and Truth-Telling Commission, on any given day you get a different message from the opposition. A lot of flipping and flopping, but you certainly won't get the truth when it comes to the Truth-Telling Commission. And when it comes to treaty, they've now said they no longer support treaty in Victoria and they've withdrawn bipartisan support for this historic initiative. This is despite the Productivity Commission having specifically outlined that the best way to close the gap will be through this type of structural reform that the treaty process will offer. And just last weekend, we've now seen, of course, as we've heard through this debate, the opposition leader also essentially, to a large extent, blame Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities for the housing affordability crisis. That's right. The reason why housing is so expensive and unaffordable is because the cultural heritage management plans, which make up less than 1% of development proposals, is to blame. Acting Speaker, while those opposite will continue to sadly use First Nations communities as political footballs, we on this side of the House will continue to listen, to walk alongside and support our First Nations communities as we strive towards closing the gap and reconciliation. And delivering on these things can only occur by empowering and supporting Aboriginal people through self-determination. That is why this Allen Labor Government is committed to delivering on legislation that enables traditional owners to take control of their own destinies and their traditional lands. In this respect, this bill will improve the way land is managed at Fragmaligan and Lake Tears Aboriginal trusts. And additionally, the bill will remove restrictions on decisions made about Aboriginal land by Aboriginal communities at some of the mission cemeteries. And does this by amending two acts which are enacted in 1970 and 1991 respectively, and those are the Aboriginal Lands Act of 1970 and the Aboriginal Lands Act of 1991. The Aboriginal Lands Act of 1970 was a landmark piece of legislation created in direct response to the First Nations advocacy from those respective communities for land rights. Well before the Mabo decision too, by the way. As former mission sites, they represented, frankly, the state's past racist, segregationist and assimilationist laws which actively sought to deny First Peoples any form of self-determination. On the 1st of January 1968, residents from these communities were listed in the Victorian Government Gazette as members of these respective Aboriginal trusts and allocated shares in trust, thereby granting them freehold title to the land. It was the first time the Victorian Parliament recognised Aboriginal land rights and the government's first attempt to recognise the self-determination of First Peoples in Victoria, specifically the Trust's community's right to own and make decisions about the land. But since then, obviously, the Act has become outdated in many respects, and some of the reforms contained in the bill today will very much go towards modernising that very Act. When it comes to reforms in the Aboriginal Land Act of 1991, that Act sought to redress some of the impacts also of Victoria's past racist laws. And under this Act, freehold title was granted over 3 Aboriginal burial sites across 3 different communities, including to the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Cultural Heritage Corporation, the Gulum Gulum Aboriginal Cooperative and the Gippsland and East Gippsland Aboriginal Cooperative, respectively, these being the only Aboriginal-led community organisations in those regions at those times. And again, of course, the reforms contained to that bill will continue to modernise and improve self-determination opportunities and processes for those respective First Nations communities. But Acting Speaker, these reforms also continue building on those landmark work that Victoria has continued to undertake in this space in leading the nation, and even prior to, as I pointed out, following on from that historic Mabo court decision of 1992 and the subsequent federal legislation that was introduced by the Keating government in 1993. And my community, which is home and built on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, was actually one of the first communities in mainland Australia's history to actually experience the process of dispossession and colonisation upon the arrival of John Batman and John Pascoe Fawkner on the banks of the Yarra from 1835 onwards. And as outlined in the book Between Two Creeks, The History of Coburg by Richard Broome, in late May 1835, John Batman and a survey party surveyed land from Indented Head to the Yarra. Batman sought opportunities for himself and other 14 capitalists of the Port Phillip Association, and throughout their journey they encountered some Woiwurrung, and after gift giving they accompanied the First Nations people to their camp by a stream. Whether this was the Mary Creek near Northgate, Preston or Coburg, or the Edgars Creek near Thomastown, various commentators contend where this occurred, but Batman was reported to have met with 8 Woiwurrung chiefs and after pleasantries explained his desire to purchase the land. However, this concept was completely alien to the Woiwurrung, and what followed was frankly a sham. Batman gave them blankets, knives, looking glasses, tomahawks, beads, scissors and flour as payment for about 60,000 acres of land and agreed to give them a yearly tribute of the same. He then had them place a mark outlining the deal, their agreement to the deal in fact. On his return to Van Diemen's Land, Batman and the Port Phillip Association tried to get the British government to recognise their claim to this land. It was a cynical effort to obtain land without paying the minimum 5 shillings an acre imposed by the then British government. The authorities declared Batman's treaty as void, as it dangerously assumed that the Aborigines were the original owners of the land, where the British Crown held that they were no prior owners of Australian land. And in that context, I commend the bill to the House.